Even when the new order was applauded by major Western countries, as it was thought to bring development and stability to Indonesia, cracks began to form in Suharto's leadership by the 1990s. The inequitable distribution of Indonesia's wealth and Suharto's brand of crony capitalism, allowing his allies and his very own children to control the economy and amass enormous fortunes, began to cause unrest among Indonesians, specifically the younger generation and the university students. Unrestrained corruption, coupled with revolution in information and communication, aided and strengthened many pro-democracy groups. Suharto's favoritism among his cronies also began to alienate members of Indonesian elite and business circles. Come 1997, when the economic crisis swept throughout Southeast Asia, demonstrations and calls for structural reforms in Suharto's governance began to increase. The value of Indonesian rupiah plummeted, inflation skyrocketed, and government institutions collapsed. The deep cracks of the Indonesian economy, Suharto masked for years, began to show. And in May 1998, the demonstrations in Jakarta quickly escalated into bloody riots. The new order was ill-prepared to face the financial and civil crisis. And once the military withdrew their support, Suharto had to also call it quits, and he had to resign. Ito naman po, without further introduction, namuno sa ating bayan, 1965 to 1986. It's interesting, when Dr. Melba and I were talking about Ferdinand Marcos, Dr. Melba said, Iha, siya ang concrete example why strongman rule does not work. And indeed, further research proved that. Among the points of a reference in this presentation, as I've said, Marcos best demonstrates how a strong man utilizes the autocratic playbook. Unang-una, Marcos embodied the tragic paradox of authoritarianism, in which he came into power via electoral rule, via democracy, but once in power, he gradually, subtly, and legally attacked Filipino democracy. He legitimized his stay in power by imposing martial law on September 21, 1972. Using the divide and rule strategy, which is used by many strong men, Marcos sowed fear in the citizenry and created an us versus them scenario. Peace and order-loving citizens in one hand, and insurgents and communists in the other. Pinagbabangga. True to the form of a strongman, Marcos also aimed to control the narrative in the mass media. Isa po yan sa senyal or red flag ng isang strongman, manipulating the media. He has done this by allowing his cronies to take over media outlets, massaging and manipulating stories to favor the government, favor him particularly and his family, as well as silencing dissenters through brute military force. By the numbers, there were 35,000 documented tortures during martial law, 3,257 known extrajudicial killings, 77 reported disappearances, and 70,000 known incarcerations. Pero ito po ay yung mga naka-record lamang. Hindi pa dito kasama yung mga actual count na hindi na natin talaga ma-account for. Marcos's regime is a quintessential strongman rule. Bakit? One, he used violence to solve problems and carry on with governance. And two, he legitimized any means to stay in the office. Dalawang signs ng isang strongman. While strongman Lee and Suharto may boast of economic successes, Marcos's narrative that his was the golden age of the Philippine economy is more of a strongman's delusion of utopia and nostalgia. Sabi po ng isang historian at cultural critic, ang mga strongman daw po ay they live in both utopia and nostalgia. The trust that their nation is great and the feeling that they have to go back to the nation being great again. Yung sa Amerika, yun yung make America great again. Pero sa atin, parang ito yung sinasabi nilang babangon muli, no? So let's be very wary of that. Marcosian economy, as I've said, may have very little to boast about economic success. Historians and economists have debunked his notion of a golden age and have highlighted the unfortunate economic consequences of the Marcos era on the Philippine economy. Filipinos experienced lost decades of development as an outcome of Marcos's regime's economic policies and management. Bakit po? Because the Marcosian economy relied heavily on foreign loans, borrowing so much more than we could handle, from 8.2 billion to 24.4 billion of external debt in just 5 years. His regime had a debt-driven growth for the country. Then infrastructure spending spree and the foundation set up by his government were used to justify the gargantuan external debt of the country. Conveniently, these successes were also used to cover up the Marcosian kleptocracy. The money laundering corruption nexus resulted in at least 10 billion US Marcos's ill-gotten wealth. At marami pong nagsasabi na baka hindi pa yon ang tunay na bilang. Contrary to others' cherished belief that the Marcos era was the golden age, it was rather a long, dark, and cold winter for the Philippine economy. And the eventual decline of the Philippines economy, or Philippines income per person, earned the country's notoriety as the sick man of Asia. It took an entire generation to offset the mishap of the Marcosian economy from the World Bank and from the Philippine Statistics Authority. Makita niyo po na sa gitna ng taon ng 1981 to 1986, nasa ilalim, sumadsad ang ekonomiya ng ating bayan. Kaya tinatanong ng maraming historian at maraming ekonomista na nakakaalam ng data, paano ito naging golden era. Now let me go to the meat of tonight's discussion, at least in my presentation. Why strongman rule does not work? Ito po yung mga dahilan. Ilan lamang sa maraming dahilan. Unang-una, strongmen provide exorbitant promises but deliver poor results. The strongman of our generation, alam na alam ng henerasyon namin ito, promised to rid the Philippines of illegal drugs and criminality in his first 6 months in the office. However, in 2020, the country was at the bottom 5 of the Order and Security Index ranking across Asia-Pacific region. Moreover, Duterte's war on drug has also placed upon the country infamy of a global proportion. The government reported 6,200 deaths related to police anti-drug operation, but domestic and international groups or human rights groups estimates around between 8,000 to 30,000 EJKs. Duterte also promised to rid the country of corruption and improve the country's economy. The country closed in 2020 with its worst economic performance, 9.5 GDP shrinkage. This is worst since 1947, since the World War II. Certainly, COVID is not Duterte's fault, but his autocratic and instead of technocratic approach in handling the pandemic resulted in wishy-washy public policies and proved to be detrimental to both the health and livelihood of his people. Second, we cannot substitute order and economy for human lives. Where there is a strongman rule, there is severe abuse of power, a grave violation of human rights, legitimization of violence, and acculturation to impunity follows. The Marcosian axiom sa ikauunlad ng bayan, disiplina ang kailangan, had been abused and weaponized the law and violently clamped down legitimate dissent and curtailed civil liberties in the name of order. Society's flourishing is based on human flourishing, not on per capita GDP. Lee Kuan Yew has even lived to see the cracks of the nation he has built, no matter how well he's worked on it. People Action's Party, the popularity of his party began to decline since 2006, and many young Singaporeans no longer feel indebted to his party and have warmed up to the fact that they are free to vote for the other parties. Nobel Peace Prize Economics awardee Amartya Sen's framework of development as freedom restores the ethical dimension to vital discussions on political economy. His shift from GDP to HDI, which is Human Development Index, puts forth an understanding of citizens' well-being that includes higher value ideals such as self-respect, self-dignity, and participation, even political participation in the society. Pangatlong dahilan why strongman rule does not work, it's because history has taught us that the negative impact of authoritarian rulers such as the ones mentioned a while ago are long-lasting, and it stays longer than their despotic era. A while ago, I mentioned about the grave economic consequences of Marcos Marcos's dictatorship, as well as the gross violations of human rights during his time. But there are more lingering negative effects to his regime. One, there's the trauma of Marcos's political violence, which is seared in the consciousness of the generation who lived to tell what has happened. Second, the constant and exhausting bout of truth with false myths, historical distortions, not even revisions anymore, and propaganda of disinformation. It's very exhausting. We face this every day. Third, ecological rape of ancestral lands due to the overmining of natural resources of him and his crony, and the marginalization of the indigenous people who inhabit them are still lingering to this day. And poignantly, the work of arts and the studies that were literally burned to the ground to suppress dissent and muzzle critics is such a loss for our generation. 77 bodies were reported to have disappeared, but there's no quantifying the information and the piece of our nation's soul that was forcibly taken and stolen from us. A treasure trove, as I've said, that could have been of my generation. If there's any consolation to this, it is that we are not grieving these things alone or facing these things alone. For instance, in Indonesia, they are learning to unlearn the seeds of anger and indifference sowed among them by Suharto's series of genocide that often targeted people of Indonesian Chinese descent. And our Cambodian neighbors, brothers and sisters, are still rebuilding social trust over Pol Pot's despotic rule that caused them to turn against each other, betraying friends, family, relatives, and neighbors. Sa pagtatapos po, allow me to emphasize, and we can go to that last slide. Strongman rule does not work because they make for a weak state. The power they amass is the power that they have stolen from the citizenry. Authoritarianism is nothing but lawlessness under the guise of law and order. A strongman breaking codes of honor, overriding the rule of law, and tragically leaving nations fragmented and demoralized. There is no solace to the strongman's promise. Historical precedents of strong men have shown trend of early term success, but the longer they stay in power, the deeper the chaos, corruption, violence, and dysfunction that seeps into the government institutions and the body politic. If a nation is to truly prosper, it will be through the quality of the people that we have become. It will be because we have a strong moral fiber, never because there is simply one strong man among us. So we need to seek to become a strong nation, and we do not have to seek simply a strong man.
We are, as Christians, clear about what governance is about. Masyadong medyo lack of clarity dito. Pangalawa, siguro yung I will talk a little bit about Christians and political engagement. Dahil tayong mga evangelical ay allergic dito.